South Korea's national debt has been hitting record highs lately. This has brought several economists to sound the alarm, citing that South Korea's economic miracle might be over. Furthermore, many government officials have become wary about the country's household debt, which as a percentage to GDP is the highest in the OECD. Due to these issues, South Korea is now being compared to its stagnant neighbor, Japan. Will South Korea become the next Japan? Well, before we rush to any conclusions, let's first have a look at South Korea's debt problem in more detail. Public debt in South Korea has been rising steadily over the years. As of 2023, South Korea's national debt has crossed 1,100 billion Korean won, with the debt-to-GDP ratio surpassing 50%. Although this ratio may not appear as alarming when compared to heavily indebted countries like Japan or Greece, the concern lies in the rate of increase. South Korea's public debt has been growing rapidly, driven by several factors, including the need for stimulus spending during the COVID-19 pandemic, increased welfare spending to support its aging population, and government investments in infrastructure and technology. The Ministry of Economy and Finance has recognized the need to cap the rise in public debt, setting a target to limit the debt-to-GDP ratio to mid-50% by 2027. This is an ambitious goal, considering the country's increasing need to finance welfare programs, healthcare, and pensions for its aging population. Additionally, South Korea's defense budget, which has grown in response to geopolitical tensions with North Korea and China, adds another layer of pressure on government finances. The rising public debt is also driven by off-budget liabilities. South Korea has numerous state-owned enterprises, SOEs, and public agencies whose debts are not included in the national debt calculation. These SOEs, which handle everything from energy production to transportation infrastructure, are carrying substantial debt loads themselves. The risk here is that if any of these SOEs face financial difficulties, the government may be forced to step in and assume responsibility for their debt, which would further strain public finances. While South Korea's public debt is manageable for now, household debt poses a far greater risk. South Korea's household debt is among the highest in the world, reaching over 1,800 trillion Korean won, or about 105% of GDP by 2024. This level of debt is driven largely by mortgages, as South Korea's real estate market has seen skyrocketing prices over the past decade, particularly in major cities like Seoul. For many households, taking on debt was the only way to secure housing in a market where property values have soared. The household debt issue is compounded by low interest rates that have encouraged borrowing. Over the past decade, South Korean banks have offered relatively easy access to credit, especially in the form of housing loans. The government has also introduced policies to stimulate the housing market, such as lowering taxes on real estate transactions and offering incentives for first-time homebuyers. While these policies have boosted home ownership, they have also created a dangerous debt cycle for many households. In addition to public and household debt, South Korea's corporate debt is also a growing issue. The chaebols, large family-owned conglomerates that dominate the South Korean economy, such as Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, have historically been highly leveraged. While these companies have played a crucial role in South Korea's economic rise, their reliance on debt has also made them vulnerable to financial shocks. The government has tried to mitigate the risks associated with corporate debt by encouraging companies to improve their financial structure and reduce their reliance on short-term borrowing. However, these efforts have had limited success, particularly in the SME sector, where access to credit is often limited to short-term loans. South Korea's external debt is another area of concern. As of 2024, the country's external debt stood at $682 billion, with short-term debt accounting for a significant portion. While South Korea has a large foreign reserve buffer, over $400 billion. The high proportion of short-term external debt exposes the country to risks in the event of global financial instability. So, due to this, is South Korea the next Japan? Well, there's a reason some see it that way. When Japan's economy declined in the early 1990s, it was because of an asset bubble, primarily in the real estate and stock markets. At its peak, Japanese real estate values had soared to unsustainable levels, leading to excessive borrowing by both corporations and households. When the bubble burst, asset prices plummeted, leaving Japan's banks and businesses saddled with bad debt. The government responded with massive fiscal stimulus packages, hoping to revive the economy. However, this led to an accumulation of public debt that spiraled out of control as Japan's economy stagnated. Similarly, South Korea's household debt problem, largely tied to its housing market, echoes the situation in Japan during the late 1980s. South Korean property prices have soared, particularly in Seoul, and many households are heavily leveraged to afford housing. If the real estate market were to experience a sharp correction, it could trigger a wave of defaults, leaving banks with non-performing loans and pushing the economy into a debt crisis. This risk of a housing market crash is a looming threat that the South Korean government is keenly aware of. One of the key factors driving Japan's long-term stagnation has been its demographic decline. Japan has one of the world's oldest populations, with a median age of 48.4 years. As a result, the working-age population has been shrinking, while the costs associated with caring for the elderly have soared. South Korea faces a similar demographic crisis. Its fertility rate is now among the lowest in the world, at just 0.72 children per woman. This means that, like Japan, South Korea will soon have a rapidly shrinking workforce and a growing elderly population, which will place enormous pressure on the government's finances as it struggles to provide pensions, healthcare, and other social services. Despite the similarities between South Korea and Japan in terms of rising debt and demographic challenges, South Korea has key differences that set it on a potentially divergent path. One of the most significant differences between South Korea and Japan lies in their respective government responses to debt management. After the bursting of Japan's asset bubble in the 1990s, the Japanese government implemented a series of fiscal stimulus packages aimed at reviving the economy, which ultimately led to a massive accumulation of debt. South Korea, however, has been proactive in addressing debt concerns, enacting measures to limit public spending and reduce household debt, particularly in the overheated housing market. Fiscal reforms, such as capping the rise of the national debt-to-GDP ratio at mid-50% by 2027, reflect the government's commitment to avoiding Japan's debt trap. Moreover, South Korea has introduced pension reforms aimed at delaying retirement and reducing future pension liabilities, a politically sensitive but necessary move to manage long-term fiscal sustainability. Another critical difference between South Korea and Japan is the health of their financial systems. Japan's banking sector was severely weakened in the 1990s following the collapse of the real estate bubble, as banks were left holding large amounts of bad debt. South Korea, on the other hand, learned hard lessons from the 1997 Asian financial crisis, which exposed significant vulnerabilities in its banking system. In the aftermath of that crisis, the government introduced stringent regulations to ensure that banks were adequately capitalized and that lending practices were better managed. South Korea's banking sector is also less exposed to non-performing loans, NPLs, than Japan's was during its financial crisis. In recent years, the government has tightened regulations on mortgage lending, especially in the overheated housing market, by introducing stricter loan-to-value, LTV ratios, and stress tests for borrowers. These measures have been aimed at preventing the kind of widespread defaults that plagued Japan's banks in the 1990s. But anyway, Do let us know what you think. Thanks for watching.